This is the MacPherson Angle.
Well, good evening and welcome to the program. It's great to have your company. Now, I've never watched much women's basketball, but right now, the WNBA is the greatest show on earth. Not because of what's happening on the court. In my opinion, the on-court stuff is not always that great. But the off-court action, wow. Women's basketball is offering fans a front-row seat to watch an incoherent worldview crumble in real time. And I've got to tell you, it is glorious. I'm talking, of course, about trans ideology, which for the past 10 years has insisted that everyone lives on a gender spectrum where it doesn't matter what you are, only what you say you are, where you can choose to be a man one moment and a woman the next. And if you think I'm exaggerating, well, I'm not. Under New South Wales law, you can change from male to female and back again on your birth certificate as many times as you like. You can only change your name 3 times, however. Pro tip, make the third name change a non-binary one so you don't get stuck with a name that doesn't match next year's gender change. You're welcome. But back to the WNBA, where coaches and players seem to have forgotten that the W stands for women. I say that because for the past week, WNBA officials have been preening and parading their enlightened views that trans women are women and that anyone who says otherwise is a bigot. Here's Indiana Fever coach Stephanie White.
What is your stance on men or athletes who test as biological male participating in women's sports? What's your personal stance?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I would say that I'm educated enough from a scientific standpoint. I don't ever believe that exclusion is an answer. I just don't. I know growing up, I played with the boys all the time.
So
there weren't girl sports.
Would you welcome a biological male in WNBA?
As I said, I'm not educated enough in terms of transgender and transitioning to give you a smart answer. I would say, though, that I just don't feel like exclusion is an answer.
So the coach of a professional women's basketball team is asked whether biological males should play in a professional women's basketball league, and her answer is, gee, I'm not sure, but exclusion is bad. OK, well, what about Portland Fire coach Alex Sarama? Maybe he's educated enough to tell the difference between boys and girls. Honestly, the answer should be a layup.
What's your stance on athletes who are biologically male participating in women's sports?
Yeah, I mean, my focus as a basketball coach, I'll be completely honest, like I don't think I've ever had to think about that. I'm completely supportive of people from all communities, all walks of life. So that's my stance completely. You know, I'm supportive of everyone in the Portland, you know, the community.
Would you be okay with biological males participating in the WNBA?
I think I've given my answer already on that question. I don't feel like I need to go deeper there.
So, in answer to the question, would you be OK for men to play in the Women's Basketball League, he says, I'm completely supportive of people from all communities and all walks of life. What does that even mean, aside from, I'm afraid to answer the question, honestly? And then there was Minnesota's head coach, Cheryl Reeve.
Come from a space of inclusion. That's where I say that common sense people get together and you find common ground to find a way to be inclusive. The answer isn't no. It would make sense for our league to be leaders in this space. What I know is exclusion is not the answer. We've got to find the common ground and be inclusive.
Yeah, I hear what she's saying. We want to be inclusive because if we're not inclusive, then we're not including people. And the opposite of including is excluding, and that's not inclusive. And we want to be inclusive. Can you imagine what her halftime pep talks would be like? The problem is that by definition, the WNBA excludes men, or at least it should. Otherwise, why bother with the W? Here's star women's player Gabby White, a woman so open-minded, her brain has fallen out.
I would welcome a trans athlete on my team or against my team anytime. I don't think it's a problem in the world.
And she wasn't alone on the issue. This week, Seattle star player Stephanie Dolson turned up to a game wearing a shirt that said, "Trans rights are human rights." Well, their inclusivity is about to be tested because this weekend, 2 former NBA players said they now identify as women and so have nominated for the upcoming WNBA draft. And this is not a joke. the two former players have officially filed the paperwork to be included in the women's draft, and they say they'll sue if they're refused admission to the Women's League. They point out that while the WNBA policy says the draft is open only to women, well, it doesn't define what a woman is, which is an unfortunate oversight when your entire competition is built around the concept. And besides, officials, coaches and players have all insisted they want to be inclusive of trans players. Well, here come the trans players. This is former Boston Celtics star Enes Kanter announcing his candidacy for the women's draft.
After careful consideration and reviewing the current eligibility guidelines, I am officially declaring myself a WNBA prospect. If simply declaring who you are is all that's required, then I meet every single requirement necessary to compete in the WNBA. My team and I have carefully examined the WNBA's eligibility criteria and governing framework surrounding self-identification and inclusion. Based on the current guidelines, I can and am officially declaring my eligibility for the upcoming WNBA draft in May 2027.
Now, it's important to note the 6'10" Enes Kanter, who played 11 seasons in the NBA, insists he's not joking. In fact, he says his legal team will insist his application is taken seriously.
I am definitely not here to mock, make fun of, or disrespect any community or personal choices. I am simply asking that the current rules be applied equally to everyone. The rules that represent the very values many WNBA players and coaches have publicly advocated for. My team and I are prepared to ensure these guidelines are applied equally, consistently, and without exception. And I look forward to the WNBA honoring its stated principles. See you at training camp.
And all of a sudden, the people who've spent years telling everyone that gender identity is whatever you say it is have a fairly large problem. It seems to me like the WNBA has three options. First, they could deny that this man identifying as a woman is really a woman, which means they'd need to define exactly what a woman is, and they'd need to explain why every past statement about inclusion was actually conditional. Alternatively, they could admit this man who identifies as a woman into the Women's League and completely destroy women's basketball. Or the WNBA could announce that only those born as women are eligible for the women's draft. That would be the sensible position. Women's sport, after all, exists for a reason, and I'm really hoping they take that third option, because if they continue to insist that ideology is more important than biology, well, the next WNBA draft could look like this. And that would just be the start. Can you imagine what the games would be like? Like I said, it's not just one biological man who's decided to test the WNBA's commitment to inclusion. Here's former Houston Rockets player Royce White.
Oh, earlier this week, I made the announcement. I'm transgender. I'm a woman. I identify as sometimes identifying as a woman for purposes of basketball, professional basketball. So I'll be declaring for the WNBA draft in 2027 as well. And I don't want to be discriminated against. No, I want fair treatment.
Now, if he says he's a woman, then according to the wacky trans ideology embraced by popular culture, he's a woman. A beautiful, brave, authentic woman finally living her truth, and a woman of colour at that. I believe her pronouns are WNBA and MVP. So what are the WNBA officials going to do? Tell Royce White she's not a woman? On what basis? Her height? If the WNBA won't let her play, well, then they support genocide, right? Isn't that how this goes? Royce White has already been the subject of hate online. He tweeted yesterday, "I haven't even been publicly trans for 72 hours, and already I'm getting so much hate. I just want to hoop with my girls in my feminine era. Why can't you all be happy for me?" I don't understand why people are upset. If a mere proclamation that a man is now a woman via the magical transformative trans wand, well, that means he's a she. So what's the problem? Now, of course, some are arguing that Enes Kanter and Royce White are faking their trans identities. They accuse them of not seriously identifying as women when some men seriously identify as women, because apparently really meaning it is what makes it so. But how does anyone know who's faking it and who really means it when they're all self-identifying? There's no scientific mechanism for establishing which 6'10" man is allowed to play against the girls and which 6'10" man is not. Rather than arguing with trans ideology, these former NBA stars are agreeing with it and simply asking the WNBA to take their ideology to its logical conclusion. All of which means the WNBA is now in serious danger of being hoisted on its own petard, because the logical conclusion of trans ideology in women's sport, well, it's the end of women's sport. When these male players first nominated for the female draft, the WNBA Players Association released a statement saying, "We embrace justice, equity, diversity and inclusion. Hate, abuse and demonisation of any group of people, including transgender people, only fuels fear, division and harm. We'll continue to have hard conversations, but we will not be used as political pawns." Here's the WNBA's problem. If objective truth no longer exists, well, then words cease to have meaning. And if words cease to have meaning, then all we're left with is opinion. And on what basis can anyone insist their opinion is true when we've already insisted there's no objective truth by which to evaluate anything, not even whether you're a man or a woman? So with that in mind, let me read their statement for you again. Blah, 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 blah-de-blah-de blah. They're angry because their fake reality is being called out. The WNBA is an empress with no clothes, and while the Woke Players Association can't tell the difference between a man and a woman, well, regular Americans can. Last night, WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert sent a memo to teams advising there'll be a meeting later this week to discuss what she called, and I quote, "a complex and nuanced topic." In other words, is 2 + 2 4 or is it 5? Well, it's complex. Or is it nuanced? The men now nominating for the WNBA draft are demonstrating exactly how we should deal with woke absurdity. You mock it, but you don't actually say that you're mocking it. You just let everyone see the absurdity for themselves, and you force the woke to admit their fantasy really is just a fantasy. Or you force them to become the bigots they claim you are. Either way, women's basketball just became a must-watch sport. You know, I always thought the great message of the gay movement was that we shouldn't stereotype gay people. Individuals should be free to love who they want, free to live how they want, free to be who they want. Because, I mean, love is love, right? Well, apparently there's terms and conditions. Let me introduce you to Andy Pobjoy. Andy Pobjoy is a gay man who owns Piano Bar Geelong, a place he advertises as Geelong's home of inclusivity. His piano bar hosts drag queen shows, drag bingo events, as well as supporting an assortment of other LGBTQ causes. So far, so rainbow. But Andy Pobjoy has just been disowned by the LGBTQ community for committing the unforgivable sin. No, he hasn't gone straight. It's much, much worse than that.
Hi, I'm Andy Pobjoy and I'm your Liberal candidate for Geelong.
Yep, the gay guy who runs the gay piano bar is running in the Victorian election as the candidate for the Liberal Party. And boy, has that created a drama. Queen. Organisers of Geelong's annual gay festival told the ABC that Mr Pobjoy had, quote, betrayed the LGBTQ community. They said, to see Andy standing alongside Geelong-based Liberal Party members feels like a betrayal to many LGBTQIA+ people in Geelong. Other members of the gay community called his candidacy a slap in the face. And I understand why they're so upset, because I too thought it was in the Australian Constitution that all gay people, as well as Indigenous Australians and migrants, had to support parties from the left. But Andy Pobjoy, well, he doesn't. He's a Conservative. And he's gay, not stupid.
I've lived in Geelong my whole life. I've raised my family here. I've run a business here. I'm very passionate about our region. Under this Allen Labor government, crime is up, cost of living is up, and housing is unaffordable. Only a Wilson Liberal government has a plan for a fresh start in Victoria and for the people of Geelong.
Yep, apparently crime and inflation impact gays too. Who knew? But now Geelong's gay community is saying it'll boycott Andy's piano bar because, and I'm quoting from comments on his social media pages, they don't feel safe or welcome there. They don't feel safe because he's running as a Liberal candidate. These are typical of comments on his social media posts. Go F yourself, you traitor. And then there was this. You're in need of a good B-slap. So much for love is love and be yourself. The abuse has been relentless. And then there's a stack of people who say they'll no longer support his business. Not because Popjoy has stopped being gay, not because he suddenly decided drag queens are inappropriate, but because he started wearing a blue tie. Love who you want to love, as long as you don't love a political party without our permission. Which is all rather extraordinary, isn't it? Identity politics claims to liberate people from being reduced to their identities, while simultaneously insisting their identity determines what they have to believe. The very people who spent decades saying, don't define me by my sexuality, are now effectively saying to this man, how dare you refuse to let us define you by your sexuality? Pobjoy told me yesterday that he believes the Liberals' emphasis on individual freedom is perfectly compatible with the principles gay Australians have always fought for. And I think he's probably got a good point. The truly radical position here is that a gay man might be allowed to think for himself. Imagine that. But after all those years fighting for the right to live openly as an individual, some people apparently want to put the political leash back on. The only difference is this time the political leash comes in rainbow colours. Pobjoy doesn't need permission to be gay, and he certainly doesn't need permission to run for the Liberal Party. If that offends Geelong's gay community, then maybe they should ask themselves why they've spent decades demanding people be judged as individuals, only to now be furious when one of their own actually behaves like one. You know, popular culture has performed a remarkable feat. It's taken a planet bursting with astonishing people, beautiful places and gloriously ridiculous moments and somehow made it all feel like a compulsory university seminar. Not because reality has changed, but I think we have. Somewhere along the line, we stopped looking at the world and we started looking at our interpretation of the world. For instance, we no longer saw trees, we saw climate change. We no longer saw neighbourhoods, we saw colonisation and privilege and patriarchy and capitalism and systemic bias and whatever fashionable ism happened to be trending that semester. Reality became nothing but raw material for ideology. Imagine a group of people watching the same football match at a local stadium. One spectator sees racism because not a single player on the field is black. The other, well, he sees environmental destruction because the stadium's electricity comes from coal. A third spectator sees toxic masculinity after a scuffle just before the halftime siren. And the fourth guy, the poor bloke, who just wanted to watch a game of football because, well, he enjoys competition and is rather partial to a meat pie, well, he's dismissed as the intellectually unserious one. Nobody can agree on the simplest observations these days because nobody's observing anymore. Everyone's interpreting. Which brings me to the now disgraced Cambridge sociologist Jason Ardea. Now, leaving aside the controversy that led to Ardea's resignation from the prestigious university, he confessed something the other day that was unintentionally revealing. He explained to a group of uni students that before studying sociology, he loved nothing more than watching Home and Away and Neighbours.
When I started watching Home and Away and Neighbours, before I'd just watch it and it was escapism. For 1 hour, I was in Australia.
But then he explained how becoming a sociologist was the worst thing that happened to him because it robbed television of its simple pleasure.
And the worst thing that happened to me with Home and Away and Neighbours was becoming a sociologist. You become a sociologist and you start looking at things through a different lens.
Suddenly, he couldn't just watch Home and Away, he had to interrogate it.
You think, OK, well, Australia has an Indigenous population, First Islanders. How come none of them are present in this utopia that's Summer Bay? Like, then you have kind of Ramsay Street and you think, oh my God, there's no people. You start looking at it really, really differently. And you kind of think lots of this have different kind of people that are in it, but it's not reflected in these spaces.
Most people spend years pretending that their preferred ideological obsession is enriching their life. Day admitted that his ideological bent made him less happy. It might be the only honest thing he's said in his life, but it's progress. The tragedy isn't that he noticed the lack of Aboriginals performing smoking ceremonies on the Ramsay Street nature strip. Anyone could notice that. The tragedy is that he apparently lost the ability to enjoy a fictional television show because it failed to behave like an Australian Bureau of Statistics census. And the remarkable part is that in many quarters, that passes for sophisticated thinking. We've somehow convinced ourselves that enjoying something at face value is naive, while dissecting every frame for hidden power structures is a sign of intellectual maturity. I'm not entirely persuaded, not at all. Some of the wisest people I know couldn't spell intersectionality if you spotted them the first 16 letters. Yet they possess something increasingly rare: the ability to distinguish between fiction and reality, entertainment and ideology, observation and projection. They understand what's become an unfashionable truth. You know, sometimes a TV show, well, it's just a TV show. And sometimes a joke, it's just a joke. And sometimes a footy match is just a bunch of blokes kicking around a bag of air while the crowd pretend their lives depend on it. And sometimes the smartest person isn't in the room, isn't the one who can discover oppression lurking behind every pot plant. Sometimes it's the person quietly enjoying the story while everyone else is busy explaining why they're no longer allowed to. Perhaps that's why the world feels less fun than it used to. Not because reality became unbearable, but because we've become incapable of just leaving reality alone. OK, the nation is waiting for Tony Burke to explain what the government plans to do about runaway migration numbers. The Immigration Minister was supposed to unveil his grand strategy at the National Press Club last week, but he cancelled at the last moment when it became apparent not everyone in the Labor caucus was actually on board with the Labor plan, which is kind of awkward because this is the same government that routinely warns Australians a one-nation government would be chaotic. Well, seems like chaos is only chaotic when it's the opposition. But while Labor consults with itself about what to do about population growth, it's running ahead of housing, infrastructure and common sense. The population, it continues to grow. And one of the reasons is the government continues to maintain migration loopholes that I think were designed with all the administrative sophistication of a shopping centre loyalty program. We learned today that 30% of people being given graduate visas, those are visas that allow migrant students to stay on in the country after graduation, well, they're not being given to graduates at all, but to their relatives. The Daily Telegraph revealed today that of 271,191 temporary graduate visas in Australia, almost 74,000 of them are used by family members. Graduate visas are up by 174% since Labor came to power, and 2 out of every 5 graduate visas are given to people who haven't graduated from anything. So while Tony Burke prepares to explain how the government intends to bring migration back under control, the system is apparently discovering new ways of inviting people in, which raises a rather simple question. If this government can't even control who receives a visa designed for graduates, why should Australians believe it has any control over the migration system at all? Joining me now is Liberal Senator Jessica Collins. Jess, thanks for joining me. Are you surprised by these revelations?
Absolutely not. We know that Labor has lost control of the borders, and we've seen now that Tony Burke has lost control of the cabinet. And we do need to get the system and the settings right. Now, the Australian government actually encourages families to sign up through the student process and sign up their families to sign up through that student visa process. And you've got to ask yourself why. Why do we want so many students and their families coming to Australia, giving them that bridging visa to be able to stay on afterwards? I can't see any measure of productivity that would add. You think about a kid that's grown up in Australia now, getting good grades at school, goes on to study law at university, can't get a job anywhere in that law system. Why do we need so many more students when you know that we need more tradies, we need more people in construction, we need that housing supply to boost? So, yeah, what's the motivation behind all of this?
So would a coalition government ban graduate visas from being issued to the relatives of graduates?
Well, I wouldn't go ahead and announce any policy, but I certainly think that we do need to look at the settings. We are going to be looking at the skilled migration visas that we'll be bringing in. We need to make sure that that matches the skills that we have, and of course the match the houses that we're building as well.
Well, while we're having migration continuing to boom, the housing crisis only gets worse. Real estate bosses are predicting rents will rise by up to 15% in the next 12 months. Which is amazing because the government told us after the budget they expected their policies would cause rents to maybe go up $2. It seems like we're being told here in Sydney rents could go up by as much as $120 a week. The $2 forecast was given to Jim Chalmers by Treasury officials. Does this signal to you that perhaps we've got bureaucrats in Canberra who are asking the government what is the answer and then producing a narrative to fit what the government would like?
Absolutely. I mean, $2 is just ridiculous, isn't it? And we've already seen over the past few years those rents go up hundreds and hundreds of dollars. So the 15% increase is going to be on top of that. Look, this is just another case of an abysmal failure by Labor. They've got a big spending agenda. They've got a mass migration agenda that's contributing to inflation. And now they've just gone out and pulled out the housing supply, the rental supply with the negative gearing changes. So it's an absolute recipe for disaster, James.
Absolutely is. All right, one more thing I want to ask you about, because not everyone's short of money, Jess. The LGBTQ activists are doing very, very well. Health Minister Mark Butler has just handed over $10 million to help La Trobe University, in conjunction with the gay activist group ACON, to train volunteers to provide gender-affirming care to people who are confused about their gender. Now, what's astonishing to me about this is that just the other week, Mark Butler announced we'd have to cut back on some benefits for the elderly because we can't afford it. This week, he's sliding $10 million across the table to what I would regard as a very questionable activist group. Is this redistribution from the working to the woke?
It absolutely is. Now, we know that the Minister has said that this is a contested space. He's pushed it off to review by the NHMRC to make sure that this is an evidence-based process and something they want to get behind. That report hasn't come out yet. The interim report is supposed to be out in the next month, and he's not even waiting for that before he's funneling all this money in. Now, my absolute position on this is protect these children, make sure we deal with the comorbidities. We know a lot of them have comorbidities that need to be dealt with first, and then once they become consenting adults, they can make their own decisions. But here we are again, the government jumping the gun, and I think being pressured by lobby groups to get this money across the line.
No doubt about that. And this government has never seen a lobby group they didn't instantly fall in love with and want to give cash to. Jessica, I appreciate your time tonight. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, James.
All right, we're going to go to a break, but coming up, the NRL's Indigenous round descends into farce when one of the game's only Indigenous players is left on the bench for the entire match. And tickets have gone on sale for the Melbourne Fringe Festival, with members of one particular race being charged half price. My panel will get into all of that after this. So should a giant bronze statue be built in honour of former Victorian Labor Premier Daniel Andrews? Well, let me answer that question in the immortal words of every NRL footballer who's ever given a post-match interview. Yeah, nah. Yeah, because Dan Andrews qualifies for a statue under a policy introduced by former Liberal Premier Jeff Kennett. The policy is beautifully bureaucratic in its simplicity. It states that any Premier, even a really, really bad one, who spends 3,000 days or more in office will be immortalised in bronze. Nah, because the three-time elected Dan Andrews is universally hated in this country's greatest case of buyer's remorse since Meatloaf was paid to perform at the AFL Grand Final. Here's the problem. The fact that Dan Andrews single-handedly turned the once great state of Victoria into a giant socialist pothole is irrelevant when it comes to the issue of a statue in his honour. There's nothing in the state's statue policy that says the Premier has to have been any good, only that he has to have gone on and on and on, kind of like a COVID lockdown, for example. And so Andrews, as Victoria's fourth longest serving Premier, is eligible for the ultimate political participation trophy, a bronze statue of himself. And why not? Don't you think Dan Andrews would have regularly looked at his own shadow and thought, nice, but what if it was heavy and made of metal and in the shape of an idol? Here's the problem. A long reign, Andrews ruled Victoria for almost 9 years, doesn't automatically equal a loved reign. And Dan Andrews is loved in Victoria about as much as an acute case of myocarditis. In fact, a new poll shows 74% of Victorians want his taxpayer-funded bronze vanity project cancelled. Even a majority of Labor voters oppose the tribute. As for the 15% of Victorians in favour of the statue, well, it's thought most of them work for the CFMEU and hope to use the effigy as a stripper pole during work breaks on the suburban rail loop project. But seriously, there's a rare opportunity here for Daniel Andrews to rescue just a little bit of his tainted reputation. What if the man himself called a press conference tomorrow to announce he doesn't want the bronze blunder to go ahead? He could say something like this. He could say, leading the state of Victoria for 3,219 days was a great honour, and I appreciate a statue is to be built recognising my service. But I recognise that my leadership, particularly during the pandemic, was deeply divisive. While I did my best, many Victorians suffered and many more disagreed with my decisions. Rather than spending $130,000 our state does not have on a statue to honour me, I'm calling on the government to use that money to fund. And see, this is where he could be creative. He could ask his Labor colleagues to use the $130,000 to fund, I don't know, half a machete amnesty bin to help fix the crime crisis he caused. Or he could ask his Labor colleagues to put the money toward paying down the almost $1 trillion worth of debt he left. Or he could ask his Labor colleagues to spend the $130,000 funding security guards for remember the primary school adjacent to the site where he put a heroin injecting room? The possibilities are endless, but you get the idea. Think of all the good he could do. Just imagine that. Dan Andrews telling fellow Victorians that just maybe a statue of Dan Andrews isn't the most important thing they need right now. It would be an extraordinary act of humility, which is precisely why it's so unlikely. And it's a pity, because a publicly funded bronze selfie of Dan Andrews sitting in Melbourne's public spaces will not be appreciated. Sure, a small number of Victorians suffering from an acute case of Stockholm Syndrome will see the statue as a fitting tribute to one of the great dictators of our time, but the rest will see it as a monument to lockdowns, mandates and government overreach. So the statue won't heal divisions, it'll preserve them. Here's Federal Shadow Treasurer Tim Wilson.
You know, I don't think Dan Andrews should want this statue, frankly, because I think it's a serious risk of becoming a public urinal.
But Dan Andrews, you could avoid that fate. You could choose generosity over grievance, humility over hubris, service over symbolism. And they could never build a statue of that Dan Andrews because, well, no one would ever recognise him. Joining me now is broadcaster Kel Richards and News24 contributor Caroline De Russo. Caroline, is there a place for political statues?
There is, probably after that person has passed, or at least a very long time after they leave office, because then you can assess not how many days they were in office, but did they leave a good and long-lasting legacy. And I think that there is something that you can see through the rear vision a long time into the future. And unfortunately for Victoria, they're still seeing the consequences of a Dan Andrews premiership today. But I think that perhaps if they had a little bit more time to look at that, the answer would be rather different. Incidentally, I think the 15% who are in favour of the statue, James, are the 15% who are still wearing masks, driving around in the car on their own.
I've seen some of those people, Caroline. It still disturbs me greatly. Kel, what do you think? Did Jeff Kennett get this right, that anyone who serves 3,000 days automatically gets one, or did he just never count on a Dan Andrews?
Look, Jeff Kennett had off days, and this was the worst off day he ever had. No other state's got any sort of regulation like that, right? Because it's dumb. And if you really want to celebrate the fact that he got 3,000 days, you need two statues, Dennis Napthine and Matthew Guy, who were the incompetent Liberal leaders who put him into office for 3,000 days. But does it have to be a statue of Dan Andrews? Could it be a big brass door because he put every Victorian into house arrest, right? Because they had to be home at 8 o'clock every night. Does it have to represent him or can be symbolic?
It's not a bad idea. I kind of like it. Maybe that could find popularity. I want to ask you about the NRL. They're holding Indigenous Round this weekend to celebrate diversity and inclusion. So what could possibly go wrong? Well, quite a bit, as it turns out. On Friday night, the Canterbury Bulldogs team ran onto the park, led not by their captain, but by their only Indigenous player, Josh Curran. He was draped in an Indigenous flag, and he'd been looking forward to the moment.
Yeah, obviously I want to make my family proud, but also I want to inspire the next generation coming through and, you know, make my elders proud as well.
Only problem, Caroline, the team's Indigenous player spent the entirety of the Indigenous Round game sitting on the pine. And faster than you can say cultural awareness, a weekend designed to show off the sport's woke credentials became prima facie evidence of the sport's systemic racism. Supporters went nuts. Curran should have been on the field because it was Indigenous Round and he's Indigenous. One person said it's crazy using Curran for clout for Indigenous Round and not giving him even 1 minute on the field. Someone else wrote on social media, as a black fella, it's so disappointing to see your only Indigenous player listed get no time on the field during the one round where we're meant to be celebrating our Indigenous players. And then someone else said, do better, Bulldogs. For Josh and for your Indigenous supporters who went to that game excited to see someone they look up to representing their culture, but he spent 80 minutes on the bench. Have they got a point, Caroline?
They do have a point. And in fact, I think the Bulldogs have handled this in the worst possible way. Either don't make a fuss about Indigenous Round, don't put him in the team. Or if you're going to put him in the team, play him because he's worthy of being in the team. And this is the thing, you should always pick your best however many people. I come from Western Australia, I don't even know how many people are on the field in a game, but pick your best side. And you pick your best side regardless of race, but don't go and try and make this a cultural performance or trying to make yourself look like you're better than you are and then not play him. Putting him in the team and not playing him is the single worst way that they could have dealt with this.
On the other hand, Kel, just quickly, Indigenous activists can hardly demand respect while insisting one of theirs gets game time at the elite level because of the colour of his skin, can they?
In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr., as you know, said he dreamt of a time when his 4 young children will be judged not on the colour of their skin, but on their ability on the sporting field.
Right? They're called progressives, but we keep going back, Kel.
Race does not matter. People have got to wake up to the fact sooner or later. 3% of us, our DNA determines our race. The rest of it is our shared humanity.
Well, it's funny you say that because just before we go to a break, tickets for the Melbourne Fringe Festival went on sale this week. And I noticed something unusual in the ticket prices. It's $22 to see a show, $15 if you're a concession card holder, which I get. Kel, you and I are getting closer and closer to that. But if you're an Indigenous person, Caroline, you only have to pay $10 for a ticket. Festival organisers are calling them black ticks, and they're listed on the website as, quote, discounted tickets for Australian First Nations audience members in acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of these lands. Is that even legal? Cheaper tickets for a certain race, Caroline?
Well, I'm not sure that it is, and in any event, I think it's pretty unpalatable. But what they're doing in trying to be all fancy pants here is they're actually excluding other black people who just don't happen to be Indigenous Australians. So the problem is, James, when you start going down these rabbit holes, you end up tying yourselves in knots. And I think most people who would look at this would just roll their eyes and think it was absolutely atrocious. And in the end, it's not like the ticket prices are obscenely expensive, right? They're you know, I mean, I know there's a cost of living crisis, but they're not obscenely expensive. Just make them the same, have concession, and then that's the end of it, because it it all ends badly, James.
It always ends badly once you start going down that path, Carolyn. It never goes well. Carolyn and Kel, appreciate you joining me. Thanks so much. All right, stick around. Coming up after the break. As I said, the WNBA is trying to work out what to do about men registering for the draft. Well, here in Australia, the AFL has just cleared a biological man to play in the Adelaide Football League women's competition, despite multiple clubs claiming that he's a risk to female players' safety. Maybe we need some Adelaide Crows boys to identify as women and sign up to play. I want to ask Sel Grover about that after this. Well, welcome back to the show. I want to go back to the WNBA story I covered in my editorial at the top of the show. And joining me now is Giggle CEO Sel Grover. Sel, thanks for coming on the show. When I saw what was happening in the WNBA, I thought I've got to get Sel Grover on and ask her what she thinks. What do you make of these men now identifying as women and demanding their right to play in the WNBA?
Well, they're just so stunning and brave, aren't they? I mean, they're just doing exactly what the other men effectively are doing. I mean, this is what's quite amusing about this whole situation is that sort of the other side of the political aisle on this is now outraged that these men are claiming to be women to join women's sports to highlight the fact that men are claiming to be women to participate in women's sports. Like, they're literally just doing what the other guys are doing. Like, men who claim to be women are men. Like, the only prerequisite to be a trans woman is to be a man. I can't be a trans woman because I'm not a man. And so you just go like, why did these people think that women's sport exists at all? Like, it wasn't invented just so that we had something to do or to occupy us. It is to showcase the best sporting ability amongst women, because men and women are different. And if you're going to allow men to play in it, there goes the showcasing women's ability. So I'm very happy that these men are highlighting the absurdity of it. And I think every single male athlete in the world should do it.
Okay, so I want to ask you about that, because here in Australia, the AFL has just said it will allow a biological man to continue playing in the Adelaide Football League despite the safety fears of female players. Have a look at this report.
Westminster's Freya Golding says she's no different from the other players on her team and doesn't pose a risk.
A big hit, but a bigger blow for the Adelaide Football League.
We, to this day, maintain that it is a safety risk.
The AFL's Gender Diversity Policy Committee handing down its verdict after formal complaints were lodged by 3 Adelaide Footy League clubs into whether transgender Westminster Old Scholars player Freya Golding should continue to play.
So, Sel, as you heard, the AFL Gender Diversity Policy Committee, well, there's your first problem, found the player who it's understood has previously played in the men's comp doesn't represent any safety risk. I'm just wondering if the answer here is for a bunch of former Adelaide Crows or Port Power players to tomorrow identify as female and demand to sign up in the Adelaide Women's League.
100%. And I mean, let's even flip this. If women started identifying as men and saying that they wanted to play in the men's AFL competition, how would the organisation feel about that? Would it upset their amazing organisation that people pay a lot of money to go and watch every week? And it's this Australian institution where we watch the best guys playing AFL. Would some women on the field interrupt the flow of that game? Yeah. So why isn't that same policy applied and the same respect given to women's sport? The problem is that policymakers are accepting transgenderism as a real thing. You can believe in it, that's fine. You can call yourself trans, you can be a man who calls yourself a woman. That is your right. Everyone can believe whatever they want. The issue here is that it is an ideology, it is not reality. And policy has to be based on reality. What we are saying on this side is that people who call themselves trans simply have to abide by the same rules as literally everyone else and play in the competition on the basis of their biological sex. There is nothing more inclusive than having to play by the same rules as literally everyone else. So these people are actually asking for privileges that no one else has and then calling that equality. It's nonsense.
Sel, you make it sound all so obvious, probably because it really is, isn't it?
It really is. It really is this simple. Like, it's the only reason that we're having these conversations, that it's seemingly this complicated, is because some men are claiming to be women. But we all know what a woman is.
Yep.
There's no confusion about this. If we just take out the elephant in the room and off the field, every problem is solved.
Indeed. Sel Graver, I appreciate you joining me tonight. All right, after the break, why are British councils replacing flushing loos with squat toilets? That's next. The British have given the world an extraordinary list of inventions: the steam engine, the telephone, penicillin, the World Wide Web, and perhaps most importantly for anyone who's had an upset stomach, the flushing toilet. In 1596, Sir John Harrington designed one for Queen Elizabeth I. And then in 1775, Scottish inventor Alexander Cumming patented the S-bend, that ingenious little bit of engineering that stops sewer gases coming back up the pipe. Then the Victorians refined the whole thing into a magnificent porcelain throne we know and love today. Centuries of British engineering, centuries of civilization saying, we've thought about this so you don't have to squat over a hole in the floor. And yet somehow Cambridge Council has decided we've been doing it all wrong. They've just spent £1 million building squat toilets because some foreigners prefer them. Joining me now is Spiked Online editor Tom Slater. Tom, please tell me this story is not true.
I mean, I was really hoping it was parody, James, but apparently that isn't the case. I mean, we've had to put up with a lot of assaults on our culture in recent years, but I draw the line at squat-style toilets, I have to say. Sitting down rather than squatting and having a proper working flush and U-bend is a marker of civilization that we should not give up easily. And the fact that Cambridge are saying that this is at the behest of international visitors who prefer it is just totally absurd. They've also spent about £1 million on some very expensive architects to design these things, and yet they've ended up with something which is so rudimentary it would have put the nose out of joint of someone 100 years ago. But this is the world that we live in, unfortunately, now.
So I've got to ask what everyone at home is quietly and privately thinking and perhaps scared to ask. Are they doing this because, you know, when I travel to the UK from Australia, I'm really feeling more comfortable on a squat toilet? Or are they doing this because of a number of migrants who've come into the country who prefer that because that's where they've come from?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the claim. Cambridge Council themselves have said that people from around the world, they weren't clear if it was migrants or visitors or tourists or what have you, prefer that. I mean, I struggle to believe that even somebody who might come from a country which sadly hasn't had the level of development that we have had would actually rather squat over one of those things than use the much more, in the old minds, traditional throne method. But yes, that is the claim that they're making very explicitly, that they're doing this to essentially make newcomers feel welcome at the cost of something which I think we should all take as the bare minimum.
I tell you what, when they said diversity is our strength, I wasn't picturing that. Greta Thunberg, let's talk about her quickly. She was spotted at a Belfast charity concert. Have a look at this.
Are you ready for the job? Ready for the job? Take you nerve?
In the bind, they summer says the silence get the attention around me. The Friday cook of the butt.
Not that I'm aware of, but it sometimes happens. I reckon that probably say something.
What is going on with Greta, Tom? What's happened to this girl?
I mean, that tricolor balaclava. I mean, she's gone from being an environmentalist to a sort of Hamas apologist to now she wouldn't look out of place on a sort of IRA demonstration. I mean, what the hell would happen there? But I think Greta Thunberg is the walking, talking embodiment of that, the current thing ideology. You know, it's just one fashionable cause after another. The problem is we live in a time in which the causes that are fashionable are different shades of depraved and barbarous. And I think this is another example of that. Also, she was there to see Kneecap and Bob Vylan, who, as all other political considerations aside, make absolutely terrible music. So that doesn't reflect well on her either, I suppose.
Well, also performing at that festival was Bob Vylan. He's the muso who yelled death to the IDF during that live BBC Music Festival broadcast. He attempted a stage dive at the weekend, Tom, and I don't know if you believe in karma, but take a look at this. Just really quickly, Tom, they're good with their Kaffirs, but not much good at catching.
Very true. That was absolutely precious. It couldn't have happened to a nicer bloke. And I think it's just so telling, isn't it? That aside from anything else, these people are famous because of their horrible political positions. People aren't there for the music, which is why they didn't even know what the drill was.
Indeed, you are absolutely right. They just let him fall. Tom Slater, appreciate you joining me. That's all I've got time for tonight, but don't go anywhere. Coming up right now is the great Paul Murray.